You're listening to Remotely We Are One, a podcast to help inspire others to take their lives back from the office commute. I'm Rick, a passionate beer rep who loves the industry but hates the commute.
And I'm Kaleem, a remote work advocate and consultant. We're going to speak with some of the top professionals who have managed to avoid the commute as they share stories from the most inspiring to the most comical, all while working remotely.
Man, this sounds exciting. Let's clock in.
I'm a sci-fi geek and really get into science fiction and, find that whole genre fantastic.
Okay. What movie must you see in order to call yourself a sci-fi geek?
Well, I mean, the usual thing in a sci-fi geek is you decide if you're more Star Trek or more Star Wars, right? And which side of that do you fall on? I'm more of a Star Trek guy, got to admit.
Okay. So just to clarify, to be a true sci-fi geek, you have to pick a side.
I think you do. It's really hard not to have an opinion. Sci-fi geeks are opinionated. You can't just sit there and go, I don't know. They're both good. That means you don't really care enough.
Okay, so one last thing. Where are you originally from?
Originally middle of nowhere, Illinois. So a small town called Taylorville, Illinois, that's south of Springfield, which is basically south end of the state almost.
Did you say Taterville?
That's what my wife calls it, yeah.
Taters?
Taylor. Taylor. Taylorville.
All right, good. Because we're from potato country up in Maine. That definitely is Taterville.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Sounds familiar then.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Welcome back to the Remotely One podcast. I am your humbled host, Rick Haney, joined by my shiny, esteemed colleague, Kaleem Clarkson.
Oh, yeah.
Looking fly today, brother.
Yeah, I got a new shirt on.
I noticed.
I'm so nervous about today's guest. Like, I've
He had
done
to go
what
shopping.
they call... Yes, I went shopping, but I've also completed what do they call the triple factor, where, you do all three
Trifecta.
bodily functions at once, basically. You know what I mean? You're so nervous.
Does that include a therapy session?
It does. I'll let y'all figure that out on your own. You guys
Awesome.
can Google it.
Awesome.
But yeah, I'm pretty geeked up about today, man. How you doing?
Man, you look fantastic. I'm good.
Thank you.
It's a beautiful spring day. I'm a little clogged up with allergies at the moment, so I'm struggling through that. Yeah,
10,000
But hey,
pollen count down here in the
oh no,
sticky,
it's insane.
icky
It's
south.
insane. Yes. Couple of housekeeping duties to get out of the way. Since you know where to find us now, do us a huge favor. Go to ratethispodcast.com/remotely one. Just give us a rating. That's all we're asking. Give us a review. Tell us what you think. That would be amazing. Yeah, since 2015, Remotely One has been one of the largest communities of remote work with over 2,500 Slack members, 4,000 email subscribers. It's free to join. Go check us out at remotely1.com. And with that out of the way, Kaleem, give us a tease or two about today's guest.
Okay, we get to keep the energy up today because
Yes.
once again, there's just so many things about today's guest. There's a couple things that I missed, but we're gonna have our guest pop in and just, tell us a couple of things. So the first thing, he's from a town that everyone has heard of. He's from Taylorville, Illinois.
Oh, yes, Taylorville.
Of course. We've all been there. He's a graduate of Northwestern. He's also a graduate of Harvard Business School. Just a little school maybe some people have heard of, maybe. Oh, he's a big sci-fi geek, Rick. Yeah.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, let's determine which one, Star Wars or Star Trek.
See, that's the thing. So he's loving a new show called Expanse, but when we were kind of talking a little bit, we were like, to be a true sci-fi geek, do you have to pick sides, Star Wars or Star Trek? And he absolutely agrees that you must pick sides.
I think so, too. I would agree.
So our guest today, he is on Team Star Trek. So just give you a little taste.
That's okay.
He's on Team Star Trek.
Respect.
A couple of roles he's done before, just a few small roles. He was a product manager at Google, another small company people may have heard of. He was a consultant and partner at one of the Big Four. Do you know who the Big Four are, Rick?
Why don't you tell me?
Okay, I think it's Bain & Company. I think it's Accenture. I think it's, I'm missing one other one. Guess, do you know which one I'm missing?
Maybe BCG, Boston Consulting Group, which is the place that I actually
Yes, yes, he worked for Boston Consulting Group. You don't
say.
One of the big four. And then there was this research project that we'll talk a little bit about. Well, he was in a senior VP of Slack in their, ready for this? The Future Forum, Rick. We have the director of the Future Forum on this podcast, which we'll have him describe it, but it's just a few companies, a few smaller companies that you haven't heard of. We're all part of this group to help us prepare for the future of work. So he was part of that. And last but not least, Frank, and this is why I pulled a trifecta, okay? He's the co-author, all right, of this book right here.
Oh,
this
my
book
goodness.
right here. Oh, yeah.
Oh,
He's the co-author of How the Future Works. Is this a New York Times bestseller?
Wall Street Journal bestseller.
Okay, we'll go. I mean, Wall Street Journal bestseller. He's just got a few people on the back here. Just a few people that just wrote him personal notes.
God.
He's got the former CEO of Pepsi Cola, Adam Grant. We've heard about him. This is the second Adam Grant we've had on the podcast. Mark from Salesforce. We got Miss Pyra Parker, The Art of Gathering. Oh, I love that book so much. She wrote a little thing in there. The CEO of Fortune and chairman and CEO of IBM. Just a few people who've read this book. So, listeners and viewers, please give a warm welcome to Mr. Brian Elliott. Let's go.
All right. Yeah.
Let's go.
Welcome aboard, Brian. Good to have you on the show.
Yes.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Kaleem. That's a heck of a build-up, man. I don't know if I can live up to that one.
Well, we're in Hollywood today, Kaleem. This is amazing.
We sure are. Yeah, I mean, look at the frame he's got in the back, too. It's all perfectly framed.
Got the book, got the whole thing set up. Yeah, I haven't been to Taylorville, Illinois in a couple of decades now, but that is where I'm from originally. And it's funny, when I started telling people where I was from in the early days, Google Maps could not find Taylorville, Illinois. It would put the location pin on a lake that was like 30 miles away. So not exactly a hot spot, but you should go travel there, Rick. There's some great spots to see.
I would love to see it. Yeah. How close to Chicago?
About 5 hours south. So it's what?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Everything from Chicago, because I lived in Chicago for years, is called downstate, right? That's downstate Illinois. But that's basically it. If you're south of Joliet, you're downstate. And there's about 5 more hours of driving you got till you get down to Kentucky.
Wow. There.
So it's obviously not on. It can't be on some of the Great Lakes. It has its own lakes in that area. Nice area.
No, it's old. There's a lot of soybean and corn farms everywhere around. It used to be coal mining. And now actually where my great-grandfather sharecropped is a medium security penitentiary. And that is the growth industry, unfortunately, in Southern Illinois. It's not great.
Well, that's a bummer.
It's just medium security, so it's not
just medium,
low security or high security.
Not high, not low, just something in between.
It's not like the one that Jake and Elwood stayed at.
No, it's not. That was Joliet State Pen.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Can we give it a reference that people that were born in the 2000s would understand, Rick? Huh?
That's not how I roll. That's not how I roll.
I mean, you know what I mean?
Look
sir.
at me.
Sorry, Kaleem, I was there with him, but yeah.
You should know by now that I am not relevant anymore.
I'm just going to make an assumption. Are you talking about Shawshank Redemption, I hope?
Nope.
You're not even talking about Shawshank?
No. Have you never heard of the Blues Brothers?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that was the penitentiary they came from.
Yeah.
All right, there we go. So the Gen Z and millennials, go watch that black and white episode on the Blues Brothers. Oh, it was in color, but barely color, but check it out.
It was in color.
It was in color.
So now that we've totally dated ourselves, we got a lot to talk about, don't we?
We do.
We do.
I'm hoping to dive more into this, but Brian, just generally speaking, in the most basic of terms, in your own words, tell us, how does the future work?
The book itself and the title for it's a little aspirational. What the subtitle is kind of gives it away, though. Leading flexible teams to do the best work of their lives. I think what we got at in the book, Helen, Sheila, and myself, when we were writing this, was the pandemic really opened up a lot of people's eyes to the fact that the 9 to 5, 5 days a week assumption that the office is where work gets done really didn't work for a lot of people, right? It worked really well for older white men who didn't have kids or weren't primary caregivers because they could do that and pull it off. it didn't necessarily work for a lot of other folks. And so we wanted to use a research-based methodology, a set of surveys and work that we've been doing to get at what flexibility really means for people. Not just in terms of things like, you can let somebody work from home a day or two a week, but how it actually improves people's working lives and how it can improve business outcomes as well. So we're really focused on flexibility as the root of that, but how does it build better productivity among teams, better connection, more inclusive organizations, and really just an ability to tap the talents of everybody and bring them together.
Wow, that's a lot to chew on.
It's a lot.
Yeah. It's a good amount. It's a good amount. So I kind of want to rewind a little bit, and because your career is impressive. I mean, you started off right out of school with one of the big four doing consulting. Can you kind of give us a little bit of a quick history of your progression in your career? And then, like, at what point did remote work start playing a role personally for you, professionally, in either of those roles? Like, at what point did remote work to you be like, oh, this is something and I need to be better at and I need to learn more about it?
Yeah, so you described, like, I started off as a consultant at Boston Consulting Group, and then I ended up later on at Google. But there's this 10, 12-year period in between where I was doing startups. And that's really where a lot of my learning came from, and a lot of pattern recognition around some of the stuff came in. A lot of it through School of Hard Knocks. So I jumped out of Boston Consulting Group in the late 90s into .com 1.0 bubble. And, there were some definite rough times there where, valuations were stratospheric and then went to near zero. And in the course of doing that, I learned a lot just in terms of, as a consultant, you get trained on the analysis is the most important thing. But what you learn very quickly when you step into that startup world is getting people to work together effectively is a heck of a lot harder than having just the right answers. It's how to get people aligned and working together in ways that they feel like they belong and they understand the goals and they're working together. About the third or fourth year into that, I found myself in a spot where the team that I was managing wasn't just in one location. We had folks in the Bay Area, Portland, Oregon, and out in Philadelphia as well. And you start trying to figure out, like, how are you going to make sure that all of those people feel like they belong in the same organization? Going through that and learning, like, how do you help them understand? And this is prior to, broadband connectivity being what it is today, let alone some of the tools being as good as they are. It required a lot of travel, to be honest. It required a lot of going back and forth because we were still operating in a world in which you assumed, even though people were, in different places, that coming into an office centrally was the most important thing for them to do. And in the course of doing that, I learned a lot about how do you help people feel like they belong to one organization, even though they're distributed. And then I carried that to Google. My team at Google, running this product called Google Express, we're operating in kind of a dozen different cities across the United States. And all the challenges that people complain about hybrid meetings, we were living day in and day out in that business, right? Because you'd have all these onesies and twosies trying to dial in while you had this one massive room in California that was kind of the main place where the action was happening. And finding ways to bridge some of those gaps, literally just to allow those people to get a word in edgewise, took training and experimentation and iteration. And we didn't call it working remote, but it was definitely all of the underpinnings of how do you build belonging, connection, and shared understanding in teams that are distributed at least around the country, if not also around the world.
So roughly what years in, just kind of painting the picture for our listeners and viewers, roughly what years were, the startup experience was, and then what years were the Google, just so that we can get context of the types of technology that were out then and what
How old is this guy? How old is Brian? Oh my God. I'll share this with you. When I started out at BCG, the way that we actually shared information back and forth was this thing called voicemail. And you would literally string together voicemails. It'd be one of those like horrifying experiences where you'd be like, oh my God, the voicemail lights lit up. And someone will have left you a 7-part message. I'm not kidding. And you learn on the machine how to tell it to go faster and go slower. So that's how old I am. Prior to email really being a big thing. Email was starting to show up, but wasn't really in heavy usage. By the time I left consulting, email was a thing, and we were figuring it out. I joined Startup World in 1999 and was doing a variety of different things in startups from 99 until trying to make a couple of them work through a couple of different pivots. Alibris and then a company called Monsoon Commerce. all the way until, 2012, 2013. Joined Google in 2013 and was there for 4.5 years, and then jumped to Slack at the end of 2017. So that kind of bookends it. Google had a lot more in terms of obviously like technology investment. It was a lot of in-house focus on things like this, like the video conferencing capabilities. And so we were learning things just as basic, but it still carried through to today as person on the video conference end wins. We would call it GVC, Google Video Conference. The person on the GVC wins was one of our rules, because what it meant is if there's 12 or God forbid 40 of us sitting in one room and there's 6 little, faces sitting on the screen, letting one of those people get in is really important because they're going to have a hard time otherwise.
Critical.
And one of the other ones was really simple. It was like, can we please have, we didn't call it a hybrid meeting moderator, but we had a hybrid meeting moderator. We put somebody at the front of the room by the screen to make sure that those people could hear what was going on as well as break in. And these things just come back to simple human courtesy. But if you've never been on the receiving end of that, if you've always been one of the people in the room, you don't necessarily get it. And I think what changed in 2020 was all of a sudden everybody found themselves on the receiving end of it. And they're like, oh, this is different. So, some of that underpinning comes back to times when the stuff was starting to show up in our lives.
Awesome.
So for all you viewers and listeners, voicemail is this thing where you call, leave a message, and the message is like when you leave your voice on there, and then you can respond, you can listen to it. So I just wanted to let people know, because now people text.
It goes onto a tape.
It did go onto a tape machine. It did. And you can fast forward it. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, back to my childhood.
It's interesting to kind of think about, like, you were using voicemails, but some of the practices and some of the thoughts as far as we need to have a place where our documents are, and, we probably need to use a little bit of async communication. It can go all the way back to when you were using voicemails,
Absolutely.
Yeah. Brian, can you tell us what was the Slack Future Forum and what led up to you working with that?
Oh, yeah.
So Sheila and Helen and I co-founded the Future Forum back in spring of 2020. Stuart Butterfield, who was Slack's co-founder and CEO, had this idea he'd been talking about with me and with others for years before that. So even when I joined in 2017, I went up to visit Stuart in Vancouver, which is where he was living at the time. And one of the things he talked about was we need to have a center for the future of work. And what he meant was we need to have
like a teaching center.
Yeah, well, more like research-driven think tank around this. And there were a couple of reasons why. Stuart always had a strong philosophy from a work perspective around some of the things that are broken. But also we had a really amazingly great research team led by Christina Janzer, who still runs it today. And a lot of that research did what would usually happen, which is it fed, product roadmap and some of the marketing stuff, but it never really saw the light of day publicly. And so we talked about this, and a couple of people had bounced the idea around a couple of times over the years. And then in the spring of 2020, when all of a sudden the world sort of changed and upended on all of us, I got to talking with Stuart and a couple other people and said, hey, look, if you're still serious, if we're ever going to do it, right now is the time to do it, because people really need help. It's clear that people's minds are much more open than they were before to rethinking a lot of accepted conventional wisdom. So if we're going to put the time and effort into it, let's do it right now. And so we founded Slack's Future Forum then, started putting in some research ourselves around this stuff, and then basically pivoted into also some partnerships. So we got Boston Consulting Group to join us, not surprisingly, since I'd been there before. Miller Knoll, who does a great job with thinking about the uses of space, and a group called Management Leadership for Tomorrow. They're a nonprofit focused on especially building equity in managers and in leaders in the U.S. And from there, we basically built, based on the research, our findings, what was working for people, what wasn't, became sort of the bedrock for a lot of great work over the next 3 years.
Fascinating.
So it's really interesting that Stuart was like, hey, we need this center, this think tank. So, you come to him like, hey, we got to do this now. But what was your thought process? And say, we need to get other leaders involved in this versus just Slack. Can you kind of talk about like what was the motivation to get other people? Because when I saw that come out, I myself looked at it like, whoa, this is amazing. It's not just Slack doing this. There are other people involved. So can you talk about how that part of the idea came to fruition?
We really wanted this to be pretty independent and autonomous from the beginning, meaning it was supported by Slack, but it was not going to be Slack centric, either in terms of the research itself or in terms of the stories that we could tell. I mean, people always were interested in Slack stories about what were we doing as a company and how are we operating, which is great. But we also knew that in order for this to actually have legs, for it to have impact on organizations, which is what we're after at the end of the day, we weren't doing the work just so that people could, get a PR hit out of it. It was, we wanted to see organizations actually using the content. For that to happen, we knew it had to be trustworthy and have a independent status from Slack itself. So that's why we wanted to make sure it wasn't just Slack involved in it. We got Boston Consulting Group, we got Miller Knoll, we got MLT, but we also started working with a lot of other companies to understand what was happening inside of their organizations, right? Because if it was just purely a tech thing also, that can often be dismissed as, oh, that's just the tech people, they operate differently. Versus getting, for example, Royal Bank of Canada. We tell a lot of stories about them, in the financial services space, or Genentech in biotech, or Levi Strauss, which is, consumer goods and retail. Having companies from different industries and backgrounds really helped sort of say, look, the research is actually sound, and here are some case studies and examples you can use that are independent of where, of the technology company sort of angle on this.
So were you getting a lot of, obviously you put this out, you have some great companies participating. Was Slack getting a lot of questions? Like, I've always kind of thought of it as, once you a few people together and people recognize that there are a good amount of organizations talking about this topic and kind of like a think tank kind of way backed by research, were you starting to get a lot more inquiries as an organization of, hey, can you guys help us with this?
Yeah.
How did you handle those kind of requests as they were coming in? Because obviously, once you published that report and wrote the book and stuff like that, like you were probably getting a lot of requests, I assume. So how to handle that?
There's a lot of that was coming in, even in the early days in like spring of 2020. I think what was happening is a lot of leaders were reaching out to each other to say, how are you handling this? How are you handling the stress on people? Are you thinking about changing your policies around remote? How are you thinking about handling Wall Street in this sort of era of uncertainty? Yeah. And so all of a sudden, you just had all these questions that were much more open. And so we started, pulling some of those people into these conversations. We would then start getting inbound. Once we started publishing our research and reports, this would have been like September of 2020. We started getting a lot more inbounds coming into us saying, hey, this is really interesting. Can you come in and talk with my management team? And that continued over time. And a lot of what we would do is focus on where can we have impact? And the impact would come from, small startups, honestly, are pretty nimble and they're going to figure it out for themselves. Our interest was more along the lines of how do we actually help larger organizations that are probably several decades in tenure figure out, what's going on in their company and how they're going to have to make some more significant changes. So we'd spend more of our time and attention there because helping, an Oracle or a MasterCard is a much more challenging thing than helping change a 500-person organization.
Wow. So just diving back a little bit deeper into something you just touched on a moment ago, talking about the big question that your book asks. Did you find like a common denominator to everybody's responses, like when you were doing your research, and what were the big challenges that you found everybody facing?
Oh, good one.
So from a research perspective, what we found pretty much right away was people want choice, right? This isn't surprising. Vast majority of individuals want the freedom to choose where and when they work, but they also want it within constraints. So we like to paint this as everybody wants to be back in the office or everybody wants to be fully remote, when the truth is most people want something in the middle. They want some regular time together with their team in terms of shared space to get shared understanding. For the Future Forum team, the way we built it up, that shared time together was once a quarter. Like once a quarter, getting people together, focused much more on relationship development, on connection, was really sufficient to get people to like understand each other as humans, as long as we had really good practices that we're also doing on a week in, week out basis. So that part was always there in terms of, people want flexibility, but they want to come together. At Slack, we called this digital first doesn't mean never in person. But the other side that showed up in the research right away that people only started paying attention to even in the last year is time matters more than place. That putting some constraints in your schedule so that 9 to 5, 5 days a week can't be jam-packed full of meetings, or meetings can't just be dropped, on your calendar anywhere in there to turn your calendar into Swiss cheese. It's much more important to people that they've got control over their calendar. And that shows up in the research in terms of people's preferences, but it also shows up in terms of the impact. So if I give people on my team location flexibility, if I give them the ability to not have to come into an office 5 days a week, I get about an 8% boost on productivity, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's about 3 hours a week, right? And 3 hours a week back of productive time is a good thing. If I give people schedule flexibility, if I put some limits on that 9 to 5, 5 days a week, I get a 39% boost in productivity scores.
Wow.
Which is just astronomically bigger. But think about it.
Almost 40% just
Almost
because
40%.
You said you can get it done whenever you can get it done. Like, don't worry.
Exactly.
About it.
Well, and what I'm doing is I'm going to put some constraints around how many hours are available for meetings. So for my team, for example, we have core collaboration hours, 9 a.m. until 1 p.m. on the West Coast was the time frame when we would have one-on-ones. People need to be available for in-sync meetings and live conversations, for team meetings, for cross-functional meetings. And that means that outside of those hours, you can choose. Am I better in the morning? So I'm going to spend a couple hours heads down in the morning doing some writing on something. Or am I better off in the afternoon or in the evening when I'm going to be crafting a presentation or writing some code, whatever it is that I'm doing? Putting constraints on your calendar, what it really does is it frees up a lot more time for focused heads down work. And that's the thing that I think that people miss the most is over the last couple of years, the number of 30-minute video calls has gone through the roof, right?
Yeah.
And the challenge with that is if all of your heads down work is being forced into after dinner or after the kids are in bed at night, after you've been in meetings all day long, you're probably not at your best. So when's all that good high quality work getting done? When I'm exhausted. So that's really why, like, we spend as much time in the book and in our practices talking about how do you get control over your calendars? How do you get control over communications as we do talking about, how many days a week somebody should be together.
I love
So
that.
what did you learn from larger organizations, and what were some of their biggest concerns and challenges?
So for larger organizations, a lot of the concerns come down to a couple of things. And we see this in our survey work too, when we talk to executives. Executives were very concerned at the beginning of the pandemic with productivity. I think for a lot of them that got better, then it got worse. It's been a little bit up and down on productivity. But one of the core concerns consistently has been culture, right? That without coming together in person, how will we ever build culture in our organization? And culture happens all the time. It's how you interact with people. It's the goals that you set. It's who you reward. It's, how open are you as a communicator? And I think some organizations learn from that and others haven't. We're now at this point where, 3 years later after the pandemic started, though you still have a lot of leaders that are falling back for what Taryn Brim on my team calls leadership nostalgia.
Yes, leadership nostalgia. I want to use that. I'm stealing that, Brian. Oh, wait.
Credit Taryn, Taryn Brim, Brymn. She's the originator on this one.
You are the originator. I'm definitely going to use that. Leadership nostalgia. It's perfect.
We'll get Taryn on your show coming up at some point, I'm sure.
We're going to have to now.
Yeah, exactly. But it is a little bit of that, right? Like you guys walked through my history already. I'm old enough to be one of those people that when I was doing the startup thing and going to Philadelphia and going to Portland and coming back to the Bay Area, I had a really deeply set belief, which was by going there, by being with those people, by getting them all into the office, I was getting them energized. There's some truth to that, but there's much more truth to the fact that how you treat people day in, day out, whether you are transparent with them or not, is what sets your culture. We see this in the research that FutureForm did too. If people are given flexibility, they are much more likely to say that their company's culture has improved over the past couple of years. And in fact, they're also more likely to say they feel a deeper sense of connection with their team. And some of that has changed over the last couple of years, but a lot of the preconceived notions about how we build culture and connection have really changed. Partly they've changed without leaders knowing it. Partly they've changed because we're also now 2 generations of digital natives in the workforce too, who are very used to using these tools to do different things.
The leadership nostalgia thing is by far the most brilliant thing I've heard so far. I talk a lot about, going back just because that's all you know. And, I am trying to have a lot more empathy for some of these leaders who, that's all they've known. But you said something about connection and culture.
Yeah.
And, hey, I'm sorry, I have to pull this from your book. I wouldn't be doing my due diligence if I didn't. But, well, not this part, but in a second. But a lot of times I feel like when people we're speaking to are talking about, well, the culture is just not the same, I honestly feel like they're mixing connection with culture, and it's not necessarily the same thing. Yes, connection has a big piece of culture, but like you said, culture is a huge, huge thing, which is why it's so difficult, because it's so vague. Why do you think, and you talk, I think it's chapter 5, when you talk about the importance of connections, in a remote work or a hybrid model, and I guess in a co-located model, why do you think the flexibility is a tool for improving a sense of connection and belonging? Like, we're not talking about flexibility as far as how you're going to get people together, but you're saying, well, actually, when you give them flexibility, they're more engaged. Why do you think that actually is?
Big part of it, I think, is because you're showing that you trust them, right? A lot of this comes back to, do I trust somebody to focus on and deliver the results? And if I'm saying
trust,
it's a big word, and it's a hard one for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. But if I'm managing on the basis of all I care about is the outcome, right? I care that you get the work done or that the outcome is driven. I don't care how you get there. That shows that I trust you to figure out the right path and to do the work that's necessary to get that job done. I think the challenge on the other side of it is there's a lot of the drive to get everybody back on a regular basis that can also be the opposite. It's, I don't trust you. And sometimes people voice it that way, but employees certainly feel it that way, even if they don't say it that way, right? Like, you knew how productive I was or wasn't at home. It was pretty easy for you to figure out the reason. Why am I now needing to be in the office 4 or 5 days a week? I think it's because you don't trust me.
Right. Trust. I mean, we've talked about it a lot on this show, but you've given this person this flexibility, this autonomy, this trust, and then you take it away. It's impossible, no matter how you spin it, no matter how many DJs you hire to play at the cafeteria or how many artists you bring in. When you say, I'm taking this away without a really good, solid reason, of course it hurts.
Especially after the way they've been doing it is actually working.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a huge bummer.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is a huge bummer.
So Brian, this is the part of the show that's my absolute favorite. Can you share with us a comical or something inspiring memory that you have from working remotely?
I'm going to go with inspiring because honestly, I don't think that I would have believed this myself prior to experiencing it and doing it. The Future Forum team, as we built it up, added people along the way, right? So it was me and Helen and Sheila starting out, but we had a lot of folks. And we were doing a call the other week because we have wrapped up Future Forum. And one of the members of the team said, I've only met some of you once or twice over the course of the past couple of years in person, but I feel more connected to you as a team than I have to any team I've ever worked with. And man, that moved me. And I would not have said that was possible 5-10 years ago, right? When I hadn't done this myself. But the practices that we built up, things as simple as the Monday morning meeting kicking off with an icebreaker that was always, or mostly always, social or personal in nature. Just the personal operating manuals, the way that we shared with one another really helped people feel a sense of connection that had nothing to do with how frequently we got together. It was how we interacted with one another. And man, is that powerful. So that was one of my biggest learnings through all of this.
That's deep. That hits deep, man.
It does hit deep. You want to talk about inspiring. Like, I feel a deeper connection to you all. I've never met you than I have ever before. I probably would have teared up a little. I'm not going to lie.
I'm holding it together for you right now, Kaleem. But yeah, that hit me.
Trying to keep it straight.
Yeah.
Well, Brian, where can our listeners find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Brian Elliott, or B Elliott on LinkedIn, but I'm easy to spot. Feel free to follow me and reach out.
Awesome. Brian Elliott, you are such an inspiration to especially Kaleem and myself. Thanks for being on the show today, and we're really glad to have met you.
Thanks.
Thank you, man.
Thanks, Kaleem. Thanks, Rick. Great being here with y'all.
Cool.
You've been listening to the Remotely We Are One podcast. Visit us at remotely1.com/podcast for upcoming episodes. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and download our episodes on your favorite podcast app.
Hey, don't forget to clock out.